What constitutes censorship on social media? The U.S. Supreme Court has delayed a decision on whether the White House crossed a line when it asked platforms to remove COVID misinformation. With more lower courts and legislators making controversial decisions that are challenged by the public, can the U.S. Constitution stay relevant in an online world? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is governing social media. The U.S. Constitution's First Amendment prevents the government from making laws that prohibit freedom of speech, the press, assembly, or the right to petition officials to redress grievances. It was adopted in 1791, some 250 years before the advent of social media. Up to now, how platforms handle controversial content has been largely unregulated. But that hasn't stopped freedom of speech and allegations of censorship from becoming a very hot topic. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court is set to rule on a series of cases that could have wide implications as to how Americans interact online. Here's a look.
Twitter's decision to block Donald Trump following the January 6 riots is still playing out at the U.S. Supreme Court. It prompted Texas Governor Greg Abbott to sign a law prohibiting big tech companies from banning users and restricting or deleting posts reflecting political opinions.
Social media websites have become our modern-day public square. They are a place for healthy public debates where information should be able to flow freely. But there's a dangerous movement by social media companies to silence conservative viewpoints and ideas. That is wrong, and we will not allow it in Texas.
Days after Abbott signed the law, two trade associations sued the state of Texas, arguing it violates the First Amendment. In May last year, the Supreme Court blocked the law in a 5-4 vote, without providing reasons. The state of Florida introduced a similar law that was also blocked by a federal judge. The Supreme Court is also determining if public officials can block critics from social media. In the first case, school parents sued two members of a school board after being banned from social media platforms run by the officials. A lower court ruled in favor of the parents, but the school officials challenged the decision. The second appeal is from a man blocked by a city official in Port Huron following critical posts. And the Supreme Court has extended a block on a lower court's decision banning the Biden administration from communicating with social media companies. This case links to measures the White House asked social media companies to take during the COVID pandemic. Broadly, most Americans support restrictions on social media. According to a survey by the Pew Research Center, 65% say that tech companies should moderate misinformation, and 55% of Americans back the government taking these measures.
But most Americans supporting restrictions does not necessarily equate to a legal ruling of the same. So, how can and how should the court decide? Well, joining me now to debate that are from Atlanta, Robert Patillo, a Democratic strategist and civil rights attorney at the Patillo Law Group. From London, Greg Swenson, UK chair of Republicans Overseas. And from Washington is Darrell M. West, a senior fellow at the Center for Technology Innovation, as well as the Douglas Dillon Chair in Governmental Studies. Thanks all so much for being with me. Daryl, I think the court further extending a temporary block on an order that restricted the Biden administration from asking social media companies to block what it sees as misinformation. That is how the latest sort of ruling or delay has been described. I mean, that really says it all. This is still very much a gray area. The courts can seem to decide based on freedom of speech, or that they can try, but I mean, where does this leave us? This kind of constant delay and this constant indecision that we're seeing from the courts.
I mean, the court decision is going to make it much more difficult to moderate content online. I mean, there's a lot of objectionable content, hate speech, blatant disinformation on a wide variety of topics. But the courts are really emphasizing freedom of speech and basically saying government officials cannot coordinate with tech companies to take down disinformation. So the result of this decision is there's going to be a lot more disinformation. It's going to be harder to moderate the content that appears online, and there's a greater risk that voters are going to get flooded with disinformation.
Okay. I mean, Robert, is that your concern as well? And I mean, is it the government's and the courts' jurisdiction to moderate that and step in to kind of, take charge over what private media companies allow on their platforms?
Well, there's always been this regulatory impact that the courts have taken. If you think back to Ma and Pa Bell, the courts have been, the government has stepped in to regulate phones, television, censorship, etc. And I think that the courts and legislative bodies have been very slow to react to the internet and to the new methodologies that are out there. What we've seen is an increase in hate speech online, an increase in violent white extremism. We saw the Jacksonville killer in the United States, where 3 people were murdered by white supremacists who was motivated by online chat rooms. The Buffalo, New York shooter, where 9 people were killed by white supremacists who was motivated by online misinformation. Dylan Roof, the Charleston, South Carolina killer for the Mother Emanuel AME Church, he was motivated and went to these chat groups. So there's definitely a role for government to stop the spread of this violence and extremism, because it has the chance of metastasizing to what we saw in Charlottesville, Virginia, where Heather Heyer was killed by groups chanting "Jews will not replace us," who were organized and came together online. So if we don't have a government that's able to respond to these issues, we'll end up with a law enforcement that has to respond to these issues. We'll end up with a National Guard that has to respond to these issues. It's important that we strike the balance between freedom of speech and freedom of expression online, but also working towards not having these types of hate groups be inspired, coordinated, and being able to organize online, because the danger to the public is great. And I think that the courts and our legislative bodies are very slow and and have had very strong difficulties in trying to get these things together.
Right. I mean, that is the issue. I just stated at the top, we said in the statistics, most Americans want some kind of restriction to stop this great potential for violence, including the violence we've already seen. But I mean, Greg, where do you draw that line? Because it is, as many will argue, freedom of speech, and then they'll say that there's certain groups targeted while others are allowed free reign. So where should the law step in?
That's the great challenge, Andrea, is, who's the arbiter, who ends up being the arbiter of what's hate speech and what's freedom, what's protected speech. And I think it also goes a bit on party lines as well. Democrats are much more likely to want more restriction, Republicans not so much. But I think, but you bring up a great point. It's, where do you draw the line and who draws it? And I think we saw that, with both the, obviously during the COVID lockdowns and with schools shut down, there was a lot of pushback and a lot of censorship that went on. And it turns out it's less important that the Great Barrington Declaration, for example, it's less important that they were actually right and proven right, but they shouldn't have been shut down in the first place. That's, even if they were wrong ultimately, the First Amendment should really protect that speech.
Okay, just quickly, I'm going to ask each of you, I think, the same question. But Greg, I mean, if you had that magic wand to do what you think would protect people but still protect freedom of speech, where would you draw this line?
I would, of course, err on the side of allowing free speech, and even if it's offensive, even if it's disgusting, it's protected speech as long as it's not, violating some other law, like whether it's pornography or inciting insurrection or violence. You see it using, these flash mobs, for example, in Chicago, my hometown, where they use social media to direct people to certain stores or certain neighborhoods to do some looting. That should still be protected speech to a degree, but obviously, when it leads to violence or on the verge of violence, it should, someone should step in. But that's not as much violating free speech. That's just stopping criminal activity.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, Daryl, listening to that assessment, I mean, how could legislators, the courts, how could they ever get it right? Because one man's free speech is obviously could be interpreted as a call to violence by others, especially the cases Robert was citing, where hate speech was at stake here, and it did lead to outbreaks of severe violence.
I mean, in the United States, we've never had an unlimited right to freedom of speech, in the sense of, the classic example, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater because that leads to public harms. harms public safety. People can end up being injured by that. And in the online world, there's a lot of speech that actually has dangerous and violent consequences for people. It harms public safety and harms public health. And as was just pointed out, like, we don't want people to use free speech as a justification for illegal behavior, like the example of the flash mobs. On January 6th, there was a lot of speech that incited violence, and we had rioters taking over the U.S. Capitol building. And so I just think the free speech argument cannot be used as a justification to allow hate speech, violent behavior, or illegal behavior. And
yeah,
we are
it's
very
strange when you look at,
crossing that line right now.
right. But now that you both cited these burglary mobs, which we've seen go down in the U.S., you wouldn't be able to prevent that anyway. I mean, they come from often fake accounts. They come out of nowhere, and they're instantaneous. So by the time they're discovered, it's too late. I mean, I'm not sure if that's a great example of how it could, protect the public. If you're able to stop them from tweeting things or Instagramming, then you would be able to stop criminals, period, in that respect. Go ahead,
I mean,
Daryl.
I'm not a big fan of fake accounts. I think there should be real identities behind social media accounts. Because when you have fake accounts, we also allow foreign entities to engage in widespread disinformation. I mean, in our upcoming election, there are many countries around the world that want to influence American elections. They're setting up fake accounts and then using those accounts to spread disinformation. So we should insist on identifying real people behind those accounts to decrease the incentives that foreign entities have to engage in disinformation.
I mean, that's anonymity is probably another controversial area because some people also feel they have the right to be online without having to identify themselves, especially if they feel their opinions might put them at some kind of risk. But Robert, let me move on to you because we are where we are now with the Supreme Court that's now delayed their decision. And we have to ask if, surely the ages of the Supreme Court justices say something here. The fact that they didn't even experience really the dawn of social media, or many of them did not, and the way especially it deals with young people. It's pervaded every aspect of their life. Do you think these justices have a full understanding of social media's power and influence enough to make some rather fine-tuned judgments on these cases?
Of course not. If you look at the geriatric nature of American government, where the two leading presidential candidates are both going to be over 80 in the next election cycle. The Supreme Court, for the most part, are people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. The United States Senate, we have the oldest Senate in American history. This is why it becomes so difficult to actually regulate many of these things because they're depending on staff, they're depending on public hearings, they're depending on things they don't have any actual understanding of, and because of that, it's being outsourced to lobbyists in order to write. You can just look at the Facebook hearings in front of Congress, where the senator or the Congress people literally had no idea what Facebook even did. Look at the TikTok hearings, where many elected officials embarrassed themselves by not having a true conceptualization of what exactly they were trying to ban. This is what makes it so difficult to regulate these issues because you have not a 1 or 2 generation gap. You have, in some cases, a 3 or even a 4 generation gap between the experiences of the people who are trying to regulate and the people actually using these devices. The children now, think about Generation Alpha. This is the generation that has grown up with not just the internet, but with smartphones in their hands from the time that they were infants. They say you set them in the back seat, you gave them an iPhone, you told them to be quiet for a road trip. They experience social media in a completely different way than the older generations. And because of that, it's going to take a true regulatory regime to step in, to look at these issues, to find the proper balances. I think that's the main issue that people are looking at, and finding a way to protect people. We've seen the levels of suicide go up among young people because of social media, online harassment, online bullying, sexual assault has gone up as a result of online harassment. We have to start finding a balance in there, and we can't simply say, well, it's all freedom of speech. I believe in freedom of speech just as much as anyone else, but just as was said earlier, there have to be some sorts of guide rails in place. Otherwise, you end up in anarchy.
So, I mean, Greg, do you think this delay, for example, is just one symptom of, Supreme Court justices that are really having trouble fundamentally getting their head around what social media is doing and how it works and how it affects the public?
Well, look, I think there's definitely some merit to Robert's argument or suggestion that there has to be some regulation to a certain degree, especially with some of the social ills that we're experiencing, especially young people, with online bullying or the information being passed around on these chat rooms. So it's an issue, but I always worry when I hear the terms like regulatory regime. I think the Supreme Court is quite capable of understanding social media to a certain degree. Their clerks are younger. I don't think there's anyone in their 80s on the Supreme Court. I think Clarence Thomas is probably the oldest, and he's in his mid to late 70s. Several in their 60s. Amy Coney Barrett's probably in her late 40s. So, and I think they're looking at the fundamental issues. I think regulating internet and online chat rooms for young people that are usually the victims, most often the victims of online bullying. Yeah, that should be done. And I think protecting underage people is the most important thing. But for grown-ups, for adults, to be policing free speech, and again, I bring up the Great Barrington Declaration when Dr. Francis Collins, the director of the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, emailed Dr. Fauci to organize a quote-unquote devastating takedown of the Great Barrington Declaration. That should be worrisome to people on both sides of the aisle and the entire spectrum. I don't think you need to be a young kid, that's an expert on iPhones or online social media to understand how devastating that can be to free speech and free discussion.
Daryl, I mean, it looked like you agree there. But let me ask as well if there is also an issue here with the way the U.S. justice system is basically set up, in that a decision in a court in one, lesser-known district or a local or state government can effectively make a decision or ruling that changes dynamics for the entire country.
Yeah, and I think that is a big problem. I mean, we're actually seeing the courts overreach in a lot of different areas and making decisions that are not supported by vast numbers of Americans. So the social media example is just one of several issues where the court seems out of touch. I mean, I think what we have to keep in mind is government in the United States historically has had a role in protecting public safety and public health. We basically got rid of a lot of childhood diseases by encouraging vaccinations. But during COVID, there was all this anti-vaccine information that was put out. Much of it was inaccurate, and people died as a result of that disinformation. And so speech matters, but it also can have deadly consequences for people. The European Union is taking a much tougher stance on this, like they're cracking down on disinformation. Their new regulations are proposing fines of up to 6% of the revenue of social media platforms if they are engaging in egregious spreading of disinformation. So I just think America has a very laissez-faire approach to a lot of tech issues. And as a result, we're experiencing the downside of technology as opposed to gaining the upside.
Right. I mean, that's a broad question there that you just lead to is whether the internet and social media has actually served the better interest of the greater good or has actually worked against it. But let me come back to Robert quickly, because I need to ask you something we actually topped the program with, and that's the U.S. Constitution itself, where the Supreme Court bases its decision-making. Is the Constitution, a document that was written hundreds of years ago, really equipped to decide these cases when times have evolved and communication has evolved as it has?
Well, the Constitution is always meant to be a rubric. It's a starting point for where we step off from. Clearly, the founding fathers did not anticipate high-speed air travel. They did not anticipate the internet. They didn't anticipate many of the issues that we confront today. However, they did set out the fundamental values of America and what we stand for and what we believe in. And pursuant to that, we have our First Amendment. We have the right to freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. But then from there, the courts have to interpret that as it relates to the modern problems, modern issues that confront us. We're still talking about internet disinformation. That's a 2016 issue. Moving into 2023 and 2024, now we're talking about AI being able to generate your voice, being able to generate your text, being able to completely impersonate you based on just your internet habits. We're talking about being able to create deep fakes of people that look exactly like them and sound exactly like them. Misinformation and disinformation moved into a new space, a new era, where even the discussions on it tend to lag behind the technology that truly exists. We earlier we have in this discussion we haven't even touched on the concept of revenge porn as it would be. If you look at the Hunter Biden situation in America, you have a shop owner who gets a hold of his laptop, gives it to a third party, and then his pictures end up spread all over the internet, all over television, and even displayed in the halls of Congress. Do we have laws in place yet that can protect somebody from that happening? Because if that can happen to him, it can happen to anybody else. Do we have something in place where if there's a candidate running for office in Virginia who may have made explicit videos with her husband, that does not become spread about around the entirety of America, or a congresswoman in a movie theater, for example? We have not been able to keep up with the rate at which we now have cameras everywhere. We now have the access to high-speed internet everywhere. And because of that, many Americans are not in a position of having any confidence that what we traditionally believed to mean privacy in America still exists.
Right. It's interesting you say the discussion lags a mile behind the technology. If the discussion lags a mile behind, then the actual laws lag 100 miles behind. And there's also this question, Greg, I'll come to you, about accountability, because we've seen cases where people have sued, online providers because family members were recruited online by Daesh, for example, via social media platforms. It's been deemed that those platforms really can't be held responsible. Is that right? Because we don't seem to have the laws in place to prevent this, but then there's also no accountability in the follow-up.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point, and I think that's the job of legislators to pass laws that especially protect children. But again, I go back to the beginning of the segment where who's going to be the arbiter, and that's why I think Congress and state legislatures should take the leading role to define what's permitted and what's not, but not letting some bureaucrat or some especially an unelected bureaucrat decide what's disinformation and what's not. And we talk about victims and people who might have died by disinformation about vaccines, but look at the excess deaths and especially the lost childhoods and lost education. For children because their schools were shut down and they were stuck at home for a year and a half. That's disinformation in itself by censoring the Great Barrington Declaration. They turned out to be right, but let's just open it up to the public square and have the argument, have the discussion, and win on the merits. So some people might think it's disinformation, some people might disagree, but let's have the argument. And that's what the problem during the lockdowns and with the government censorship is the view that turned out to be the correct one ended up being censored and silenced. So wouldn't it have been better? I'm not saying that they should have censored the other side. Let both sides make the argument. The government was making the argument that school closings were good and that vax mandates and mask mandates were a good idea. The Great Barrington Declaration was arguing for more targeted protections, especially for elderly people. Turned out to be right. Again, I'm not suggesting that they should have censored anyone.
There are plenty of people that say that did not turn out to be right, and that the best, even though with extra caution, the best path was taken to protect as many people as possible. I mean, here we are again. People are saying what was right. We're not even sure if history is completely proven if there was a right way or a wrong way to do it. But I have to move on, Daryl, quickly, because there's this issue about this maybe potentially in-between area, I'll call it that. So, for example, in the case that we're looking at now, even if a White House decision on social media cannot be enforced, can it at least be suggested? Can there be an official kind of governmental advisory but no legal enforcement, so nothing actually has to be taken offline, but the government can say, hey, this is where we stand, but again, now you can have your freedom of speech in these private social media companies that allow you to go ahead with your own messaging.
I mean, I think where the government has a very legitimate role in helping to moderate content is in regard to foreign entities trying to influence American politics. There's going to be a skyrocketing of disinformation coming from abroad. Government agencies actually have access to much better information about what these foreign entities are doing. Private individuals actually aren't in a very strong position to evaluate that. And so that's an example where government has unique access to information, and it's information that actually could threaten public safety and public security if it is not acted upon. And so it seems to me there is a legitimate role for government officials to talk to tech companies, to express their views, to point out content coming from abroad that is malicious in nature and designed to really disrupt or destabilize American democracy. Like, that is a legitimate role of government, in my view.
Daryl, that will have to be the final word. Very unfortunately, we're completely out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.